Welcome to the Jaime Fleres Podcast, a sanctuary for soulful creatives, leaders, and heart-centered humans navigating the edges of creativity, authentic expression, and personal growth. I'm your host, Jaime Fleres, author, transformational guide, and founder of Whale Song Creative. Today, I'm dropping in for a solo episode to talk about the world of editing, book editing specifically. So I wanted to share a little bit about the editing process, when to hire an editor, what that process looks like, how to self-edit, and all of these sorts of things. And for those of you who are in the process of writing a book and are curious about this stage of the journey. So a little bit of background if we're new to each other. I've been a book editor and have worked in the professional editing world and writing world for 20 years. My agency, Whale Song, is a creative agency devoted to helping people write transformational nonfiction and memoir books in the realms of personal growth and spirituality. Our agency helps people edit their books. And so I wanted to share a little bit more for those who have questions about the editing process here in this podcast today. I'll be speaking specifically about editing books in these genres. So not so much fictional works and not so much the kind of editing, the thing we call editing that happens inside of a traditional publishing house, which is just a little bit different than a service that we seek out by a professional editor, like a freelance editor or an agency like ours during the process of writing your own book. So we'll talk a little bit about how editing fits into the publishing process as well. So I wanted today go over what the kinds of editing are, what to expect in that process, how to anticipate cost and why the cost is what it is for solid professional editing, when to start, the role of AI in editing, and how to do some of the self-editing work on your own. So today I want to talk a little bit about publishing first, just to give us some context. So there are two primary ways of publishing a book. There's actually many, many ways and many variants, but these are the two primary ways, which is one, to secure a traditional book deal, a traditional publisher, and to go through their process of publishing a book. And then the other is to self or independently publish. And that is a little bit of a different path. And so I wanted to just talk about editing in those contexts. For the traditional publishing path, typically, this can happen in a few different ways too, but typically the way that you seek out a traditional publisher is that you write a book proposal. And in that proposal, you have some summaries of all the chapters in your book and some sample chapters. And then you pitch that proposal that you create to a publisher. Let's just say they decide to give you a book deal. And in that process, you will receive some editorial support in bringing your manuscript to completion. So you might bring them a very first rough draft. You might bring them a more polished draft. So in that case, editing will look a little bit different and what kinds of services you might want to seek out and when. Essentially, you'll want, in order to even create that book proposal, you may need some support in an editorial or coaching capacity to help you bring the manuscript to readiness for that book proposal, that you feel clear enough about your concept, clear enough about the structure of the book, and have really solid, strong sample chapters to present it as part of your book proposal. So in that case, some of the editorial support that you might need in that process is someone that can help you design and develop that book proposal, including those chapter samples. And so you may have those samples edited. You may have, you might work with a book coach, such as someone from our team, Whale Song, who helps you develop a really strong structure and a really solid concept in the book proposal. So that might be one place. If you're pursuing a traditional publishing deal, that might be a place where editing would come into play and some editorial support. The other place it may come in, and we get this all the time, is that people are traditionally publishing, but their work is in rough form in their first draft, which is very common for all authors, is for our work to be in a rougher form. And so we often work kind of as a preliminary step with authors in their book editing process so that they bring a more refined, polished, professional draft to their traditional publisher. So sometimes you might work with an editor, especially a developmental editor, which we'll talk more about. You might work with a developmental editor, even if you're doing a traditional publishing deal, knowing that they will take it from there and do their rounds of editing with you as part of their service. So even if you are traditionally publishing, some preliminary editorial support, especially in the proposal and in the first draft of your book, may be something that you hire out. So that's traditional publishing. Self-publishing, basically you're the entrepreneur for your book. So you're in charge of, hiring and managing the team that will help you bring your book into the world. That can include a book coach while you're writing your book, a book editor while you're in the refinement process, and then all the way down to proofing and making sure that the book is 100%, ready to go to market. So in that sense, you would be in charge of, seeking out a professional editor and professional editing services the whole step of the way. Whereas in traditional publishing, some of those latter steps, which we're going to get into, are covered by the publishing house. So that's just a lay of the land to kind of give you some context about the kinds of publishing options and how that affects editing. But editing itself, in my perception, in my experience, and I've been working in this industry for a long time, and this is how we do it at Whale Song, which is that we have sort of 3 levels of editing that we use. And then there's a couple of other things that I want to talk about here first. So we'll talk about those 3 levels in a moment. But the first one actually is kind of a 4th category, which is what we call a manuscript evaluation. So let's say you're working on your draft. Maybe you're toward the end of your first draft. Maybe you're in the middle and you're like, I'm kind of hitting some kind of threshold where I need to pause, or I'm not sure where to go next, or I'm not feeling like things are clear enough in the book, or I'm feeling a little discouraged. I need some support. The best editorial service for you in that situation would be a manuscript evaluation. And a manuscript evaluation gets your writing in front of an editor where they're reading the whole thing and they're giving you structural and developmental feedback kind of at a checkpoint. They're not necessarily doing a very, very thorough edit, but they're getting a good sense of the work so that they can advise you on how to proceed best. That's typically how we work with a manuscript evaluation. So those can be great checkpoints so that you can start to get some guidance, some clarity, some direction, some affirmation even, and validation of where you are in the book, and just a lot more clarity so that you're able to finish that first draft in a good way and in a clear and focused, guided way. Manuscript evaluation is one kind of type of editorial service that you might go receive. So I would say the best time for a manuscript evaluation would be during the drafting process or at the very beginning of, like I'm not even quite ready for an edit because things are still really coming into form here, but I'd like a kind of a checkpoint so that I can be directed in my efforts forward toward revision. So that's a manuscript evaluation. And then we have these 3 levels that we offer at Whale Song as well. We offer manuscript evaluations too, but the 3 levels I often talk about are a developmental or structural edit, which is one thing, a line edit, or sometimes called a copy edit, and then a proofread. So a developmental edit is a little bit like that manuscript evaluation, except it's a much more thorough and much more specific. We're actually focused on the structure of your book as a whole and the structure of your chapters and, really looking at the content in a structural edit or a developmental edit. And this is a really important editorial stage that really can't be skipped over if you want a really strong, solid book. This is not something that can be outsourced to AI. This is not something that you can do. I mean, if you do this on the cheap, like you're going to get what you pay for. But this is actually a very complex task of an editor coming into your book as it's drafted and really taking a look at structure, like kind of skimming out from the forest, from the trees, all the way down on the ground, which is where the author has been, like working to create all of these aspects of the book that are coming together in form. And a developmental editor really comes in and looks at structure. How is this book laid out? What is the sequence? What is the ordering? What is the structure of this thing? Is there a solid framework? Is the scope appropriate for the book and its reader? Is it promising one thing and carrying out another? Is it staying true to the promise that it makes to its reader about what it's going to do and how it's going to do that, right? So there's a lot of big questions that we're asking there, and that requires someone who has the developed skill of being able to see structure inside of a book. Because in my experience, most new authors, and even any author who's inside their own work, has trouble seeing its structure, has trouble seeing the movements of what the work is doing, not just saying. And so you really need somebody who's able to see that. And that's something that we've cultivated here. I've been doing this for 20 years. So I sometimes say that, I have this spidey sense of seeing structure, and I've edited many, 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 many books. And, oftentimes I'll find something like buried in chapter 9 that needs to come to the front, or something needs to be brought into focus a little bit better, or, pacing, like we're spending a little bit too much time on this story and not so much this, or that sort of thing. So there's a lot of really kind of high level cognitive work that happens around a structural edit and a developmental edit. And this is that time, I call it remixing sometimes, because it's that time where we might swap chapters around, or a chapter might be eliminated because it's outside of scope, or, a lot of big movements can change, or a lot of big things can change in a developmental edit, where we're really starting to shape the work. So I really think of a first draft as just getting your ideas down on paper. It's kind of like taking everything that's inside your beautiful mind and getting it out into form, but then it needs to be shaped, right? It's like we're making clay, right? Like out of the mud by the creek. And now we have to shape it into something. So we have the clay now, but now we need to shape it, right? We need to refine it and create that structure that's going to serve our work and that is going to serve our reader best. So in a developmental edit or structural edit, I'm always looking for two really big movements. One is, what is the major arc of the whole book? So where do we begin? Where does a reader pick us up on our journey? And what kind of journey, what is the nature of this journey that a reader or writer is taking us on? And where do they leave us? And what is that journey along the way? Is that a cohesive arc? Is that something that a reader can follow really well? Is it staying true, again, to that promise of the book and what your reader actually needs and what they don't need? And is it the best structure and the best journey that one could take through this? And that's really a big question to ask, that's uniquely applied to every book. So that's the one first major arc we look at. And then the second major arc I look at is the chapter structure. So especially with a nonfiction book, but also with memoir, we want to have a replicable structure of every chapter. And I'll say that this is beneficial to both your reader and to you as a writer. So we want to have, I'm always using metaphor. So there's a couple of metaphors that I like to use here. One is that there's a replicable rhythm in each chapter where we're doing kind of the same major moves in every chapter, even though the content obviously is unique to each chapter, but the same thing is happening again and again and again. And then I also talk about the ingredients. Like we need a certain amount of stock ingredients for every chapter that show up every time. So for example, oftentimes in nonfiction, one example of what that replicable structure or set of ingredients are is that, we open with an interesting story. We frame that story to illustrate our main idea for that chapter. We then go on and explain these different facets of that concept to our reader, and we might add in a few more anecdotes, or maybe we bring in case studies. And then we end with some kind of application. So that might be reflection questions. It might be a practice. It might be a meditation. It might be an activity to go do. It might be a ritual or, something like that. But that's the structure that we're repeating every single chapter. So we get the story, we get the concept that it's illustrating, we get these fine points about that concept that our reader can really understand. We give an application of the material so that your reader can really integrate it into their lives. And then we do that again. So a good structure, a good replicable chapter structure is not actually really going to be noticed by your reader, because your reader is going to be engrossed in the content, right? But they're going to say things like, wow, this book felt really cohesive, or I felt like I was really carried through the book. They know what to expect, even if they're not consciously expecting it. They know what they can expect. Not every chapter is a new surprise with a new structure and that sort of thing. So, and then it's also helpful as a writer to have this replicable structure, because you know the key ingredients that need to go into your soup. You're not creating something from scratch every time. You're going, oh, there's these key moves that I do in every chapter, and I'm going to rinse and repeat the structural moves, not the content. Obviously, you want your content to be unique in every chapter, but you do want to have these replicable moves. So we really focus on clearing up, like making sure that those two movements, the arc of the whole book and then the arc of each chapter, has some coherence to it, has that consistency that creates cohesion and clarity in our books. So those are things that we look for in a structural or developmental edit. We're also looking for places where things are redundant or tangents are gone on, or we're not getting to clarity about a certain point, or we're not clear anywhere where we're not clear as readers in the process. So there's a lot of work that goes on in that process of really clarifying within a developmental edit the book shape and structure. So those evaluations, those developmental edits are really, really important. So skipping over that step is something that is often, going to create a book that is not as strong and not as well met by its readers as it could be. And so that's a really important step. And I will say, like, even in my own journey as an author, like the very first book that I wrote and published, I had a couple of rounds of developmental editing where we were really, really refining structure. We were really, really looking at my communication of my ideas so that I got it to a place where it was like the best transmission of that information that I could put together. And so that work can be a process. A lot of us, especially when we're new writers, don't anticipate just how important the editing process is and just how much changes then. And that can kind of stop us up sometimes too, because sometimes we're writing the first draft of a book and we're comparing it to other people's final drafts. And we don't realize like how much actually changes in the drafting and editing process. So this is such an important process. So once we are done with, let's say we've had a manuscript evaluation during the drafting process, we've brought it all the way as far as we can to the finish line, and then we're having a developmental edit on the full draft. And then once we're done with developmental editing, whatever number of rounds that requires, a combination of self-editing and supported, editing with a publisher or an editor, then we move into line editing, which is also sometimes called copy editing. So line editing really focuses on the paragraph and sentence level structure of your book. So line editing is also, it's its own animal. It's a different kind of approach and a different kind of way of reading your book. So instead of looking at structure and how everything's ordered and organized, we're actually really focused on the strength of your sentences and the potency of your language. So we're cleaning up things like run-on sentences and wordiness and, errors in grammar or punctuation, or, kind of clarifying and crystallizing things down at the paragraph and sentence level. And this is a really, really important piece of the process as well. The reason we separate these in our work is they're two different levels. So it's like if we were to do a line edit, if we were to really focus on like sentence structure while we're still getting the structure of the book itself done, you might cut out a whole paragraph or a whole section that doesn't need to be line edited. Like it doesn't need to be looked at the sentence level. And so we really like to keep these things distinct and separate because it helps to just focus on structure when we're looking at, just structure and content when we're looking at a developmental edit. And then once that's done, then we know everything's pretty situated in the manuscript. We can start to fine tune and refine things from there. That's when we do a line edit, where we really consider, like, is every word doing its job? Are there any ways that we can say this more succinctly, more clearly for the reader, more potently? Are there transitions between ideas? Are we making sense, as we go from one idea to another or one chapter to another, all of that sort of thing. So a line edit is a very, very careful look at every single sentence in your book to make sure that it's as strong as possible. Sometimes copy editing also includes things like fact checking and, doing like end notes, works cited kind of thing. We don't necessarily do that kind of fact checking for our authors. That's something that they handle themselves. But we really are looking at the line edit, like really enhancing line by line every sentence of the book. So that's a line edit. And then the last one is a proofread, and that's the final pass. So in this process of developmental and structural editing and line editing, there's lots of back and forth in the manuscript. There's lots of changes being made. I say back and forth as between author and editor. There's a lot of drafts and versions of the book as it's moving toward refinement and toward its final stage. And so a proofread isn't really required until everything is just done. Like everything's just it's right where it needs to be in the manuscript. It's been line edited. All the sentences have been cleaned up. And now we're just doing one last pass to make sure that there's no outstanding errors. And you'd be surprised, actually, even when I've done many, many proofreads, and there's always dozens of little things that were missed in the line editing phase that get polished up and finalized in a proofread. Sometimes authors want to skip over a proofread because they're like, oh, we've looked at this draft so many times, it's great. But here's the thing, you've looked at your draft for months and months and months and months, and you've seen many, many iterations. Your brain is already correcting those little tiny things without even noticing. So you're not actually seeing those tiny little errors. So it's good to have a proofreader make a final pass of your draft just to catch those errors and little things. There's a lot that needs to be kind of brought to consistency and accuracy in a manuscript. And so I definitely suggest that you don't skip a proofread. Now, we'll just talk briefly about we all want things that are cheap and easy, right? Especially in this era of like the cult of convenience. But I will say that, first of all, I don't believe that an edit, like a developmental or structural edit, can be outsourced to any kind of machine. Like that requires real human thinking, real human evaluation of a manuscript. Line editing, I don't know AI to be able to do anything like line editing. I mean, sure, they can clean up some sentences, but I don't necessarily think it's a very strong tool. Even at the proofreading level, if you're using a machine to proofread, it's going to miss things. Things might be spelled right that are actually the wrong spelling for what you mean, and it won't be caught. Even something like Grammarly is pretty good, but you still need a human who's interfacing with those suggestions to see if they're actually accurate. So there is nothing, I will stand on this hill with my flag flying. There is no machine that will replicate what a human can do in a book. Part of the reason that it's so important to really invest well and to take seriously the editing process is that even down to proofreading, if you have errors or redundancies or places where your reader is getting lost, that is a huge hit against your ethos and your authority and your integrity and your trustworthiness as a writer. Even small errors, right? Of course, every book usually has like one or two little errors in it. Even like the biggest best-selling books, you can find them. But the more errors and the more work your reader has to do in reading your final manuscript, the more it's going to count against you as a credible author and actually do more harm than good. So it's really important that you invest in this work. And it's difficult, even as an editor, somebody who's been in this business for 20 years, I still hire editors for my projects all the time because you need somebody who's not in your body and brain to look at the work from a different perspective. So it's really, really important, even if you are a really strong writer, to get good editorial support. When to get started on this. So I will say, okay, manuscript evaluation during the drafting process might be a great place to do that. As far as when to do this, I highly recommend that people do some self-editing first, right? Because if that first draft is just about you getting your ideas down on paper, you need to do some refinement first. You need to go through and look at the structure and look at what's working and see what form it's taken and really take inventory. So I have a whole course on in the Author Academy, our Author Academy at Whalesong, that's called Self-Editing Superstar. And it walks you through the exact method that I use when I'm self-editing and the exact method I use when I'm editing to walk through how to look at our own work, which is so, so important. I really believe that you should only bring in a professional editor, especially at that like developmental structural edit and beyond, once you've done some self-editing first. And the reason being, I always say to people, take the work as far as you can get it and then bring in a team. Because if you bring in a team or an editor when you know that there are big things that need to change, when you're like, I know chapter 9 doesn't make any sense right now, or I know that I didn't even finish that one part, or I know that that part doesn't really make any sense and it needs to probably be moved over there. If you go seek an edit at that point, your editor is just going to tell you what you already know. So you're not getting any benefit. You're not getting your blind spots checked. You're not getting things revealed to you that you couldn't already see. You're actually paying someone to do the work that you already know needs to be done, right? So I always say, take it as far as you can, get it as polished, and especially at the structural level, as far as you can, until you're like, you know what, this is as far as I can take this draft. I need somebody to look at this. And that's when you'd bring in an editor. And that's when we can start to like really bring some magic to the table that you hadn't seen before in terms of the draft. So it's really good that you do some self-editing first, and Self-Editing Superstar is a great place to do that. And that's something that you can go check out on our website. It's a really affordable course that'll walk you through like what to do. And you can use that course even in the drafting process as you're looking to kind of take inventory and take stock while you're writing. So Self-Editing Superstar is a great resource. The other thing too is that my book, The Author Adventure, is a great resource. I have a whole section on self-editing and professional editing, and there's much more detail than I'm covering in this podcast. So definitely go check out the book. $25 for that resource is like such a steal, and there's so much good wisdom in there. So if you don't have that book and you're an aspiring author, you should just go get it. But that book has a lot of more detailed support that I'm offering even in this podcast about self-editing and the editing process and when to do it and all of that. So, okay, so we've talked about the types. We've talked about when to start. We've talked about AI and tech. Again, limited role. If you really want a good quality book, AI is still not where it's at. You might be able to get some polishing done there, but I promise you that it's going to look and it's going to read like AI and not like you. And you do not want that in your book. You do not want that. We need your voice on the page coming through. So the other thing I hadn't talked about yet either is beta readers. So there is another stage in kind of the refinement process where we may not hire because they don't actually get paid generally. Beta readers are actually readers that you might ask if they would be willing to read your manuscript and give you some feedback. These are typically non-professionals. They're typically not editors. And this is a way, I like this step actually as part of the refinement process. And we'll talk about when to bring in beta readers. So typically, again, beta readers are non-professionals. So the Author Adventure talks about all the pros and cons of beta readers and what to consider here. I really like beta readers as blind spot checkers. So for example, when I was writing my first book, Birth Your Story, which is about birth stories and how to write your birth story as a parent or, as someone who's experienced the birth of a child, I knew that I only had my own life experience as a woman who'd birthed my child. I didn't have the psychologist perspective. I didn't have the midwife perspective. I didn't have the perspective of a father. And so I chose specifically beta readers who were in a different audience, a different readership, a different role as I was. And I asked them to read the book from their perspective. And I got really great feedback there. So, I got some questions raised. I got some thoughts to consider. I got an understanding of the impact of how did that idea that I shared in that chapter land with a father or something like that. So I got really, really good feedback there. So the benefit of a beta reader is that you can actually, again, I like to use them as blind spot checkers or different perspective checkers on my topic. And I recommend that. And you'll just get some different perspectives so that you can start to get a sense of how it's being received by others. That's a huge benefit of beta readers. Typically, beta readers are not paid. They're not actually performing an editor service. They're more like a manuscript evaluation. It's more like, let me give you some feedback. However, a manuscript evaluation is still different because that's a professional editor's eyes on it. So that's the thing to just take with a grain of salt with beta readers is that they're not professional editors. They haven't spent years and years and years getting trained on how to look at structure and how to talk to somebody about their writing, right? A lot of times what I find is that readers, for better or worse, we just do this. We project our own ideas onto somebody's work. We have these I find beta readers sometimes can just have kind of interesting ideas about what to do with your work that may or may not serve you. So you might get some feedback that's actually really not supportive during that time either. So with beta readers, it's really important, a couple things there. It's really important that you give them clear parameters. This is how I would like to receive your feedback. This is what I would love for you to consider as you're reading. The more specific parameters you can give a beta reader for what to look for and how to read your work and how to give feedback, the better feedback you're going to get. Versus if you're just like, hey, could you read my book and tell me what you think? It's pretty wide open. So giving them clear expectations, understanding, a clear request, clear timeline, all of that is going to be really helpful. And then always taking what they say through the filter of your own knowing. Like you know your book better than anyone. This is true for editors too. You know your book better than anyone. So people are going to give you feedback and you get to filter that through your system of what you know this book is. You know it, again, you know it better than anyone. So take the feedback that serves you and leave the rest. Even in editing, I always say take 90% of the feedback and let the other part go. Or let that feedback be something you push against so that you can get clarity in your own way. It's really important that we, especially with beta readers, just consider the feedback for what it is and take in what actually serves us in our project and leave the rest. So that's beta readers. And those can come in, as far as timing of beta readers, oftentimes, I think personally, the ideal place to put the beta reader stage is after you've done the first draft and done some self-editing. So you've done some of your own refinement, and maybe before the editorial stage. So you're getting some of that feedback on the ideas, the concepts. You could also do it after a developmental edit. Although, again, if you're getting feedback that you might want to implement, then that's going in to change the work considerably. So I would suggest doing a beta reader stage before you hire professional editors. And that way, any blind spot checks that cause you to want to add a section or take out a section or change the language in a section, you're already handling before you bring in professional editors. So a couple of other things about editing, timeline and cost. So oftentimes, like I will say, like our agency, because we are such experienced editors, we are not like the $5 Fiverr ad. Like that's not the work that's not the quality of work that we do. It's the difference between like going to a McDonald's and going to a 5-star restaurant. Like you're going to pay for what you get in editing. Editing is often an expensive endeavor because of the level of work required. So both on developmental edits and line edits, as an editor, for I would say like an average manuscript length, like something between 50 to 75,000 words, we're spending like upwards of 40 to 50 hours with your work. So not only are we reading it really slowly and carefully, but we're doing that careful thinking work about structure. We're doing careful thinking work about your reader. We're taking a lot of time to consider the presentation of your ideas. That's all in the developmental edit. And then in the line edit, we're going through every single sentence with a fine-tooth comb, and not only just reading it, but thinking about, is this the strongest way to say this? Is there a way to say it better? Are there any redundant words? Like there's a lot happening in an edit. So it's not a fast thing. If someone says they can turn around a whole manuscript in a week, I would be very suspicious, unless that's all they're doing and they just don't need to sleep that week. But it is a laborious process. It is a time, if someone's going to really get into your manuscript with you, like come all the way down into the thicket, into the jungle understory with you of your book and really root around and do the bushwhacking and kind of, really explore that territory with you and be in it with you, that is a big investment of time, energy, and skill. And so you're going to pay for that because it's worth the investment, because the return on that investment is a really, really strong book and a book that is solid and it is reputable out in the world. And so it's worth doing that. And then as far as timeline, sometimes people are like, okay, I wrote my first draft, like I'll be putting it on Amazon in 6 weeks. It's like, or next month. No, editing is a process. So I would say to expect the editorial process to take 6 to 12 months, depending on how much support and back and forth you need, what pace you're able to get to revisions, all of that. But typically, at least for us, our industry standard for a book length manuscript of editing is usually about 2 months to do a developmental edit alone, or a line edit alone, or even a proofread can be that long. Sometimes they're shorter if it's a shorter book. Sometimes it's longer if it's a longer book. But that's pretty standard, is a couple of months, because it takes that long to do the 50 hours of work or so to make that edit. So even if you think about like 2-month chunks, that's just 4 months, right? But you've got to edit and do your own revisions in between. And then we still have the revisions that happen after a line edit. And then we have proofreading. So it's at least a 6-month process if you're doing it right. And if you're doing it in a really thorough way. So those are some things about editing a book. Let me know if I missed anything. If you have any questions about the editing process, please reach out to me. I'm at jaimefleres.com. So you're welcome to reach out with editing questions. And, our agency is, we have very, very seasoned editors on our team. We really get into the world of your work together and really inhabit that work with you so that we can bring you the very best feedback and guidance and support as you work to refine your manuscript. And we also offer editorial coaching. So if you've got feedback from a draft and you're like, okay, I need to do this, this, and this, and I'm not really sure how to do that, we walk you through every step of that so that you can feel empowered and confident in the ways that you're shaping your manuscript. So those are also invitations. Self-Editing Superstar is a great resource if you're thinking about refining your work, or you're even in the middle of a drafting process. Like I highly, highly recommend that program. It's very, very supportive and will give you a lot of tools that you probably don't already have in how to do self-editing. And The Author Adventure is also a great resource. So I definitely recommend checking out that book. It's such a low cost way to get so much resource for your writing process. So thank you so much for joining me as we geeked out today on the editing process. I hope that was supportive to you. I appreciate you joining us on this episode of the Jaime Fleres Podcast. If you love the episode, please share it with a friend, or if you know somebody else who's writing a book, please share it with a friend so these conversations can continue to spread and support others. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And your reviews are also so greatly appreciated, as that is what helps us get noticed by the powers that be and by other listeners. If you want to check out our work or you have any questions about working with whale song, please reach out. All of our links are also in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to connecting with you again.